All right, so now we're going to talk all about type 1 and type 2 errors as they relate to these hypotheses. With hypotheses testing, there are 4 possible outcomes. The first outcome is that you choose not to reject the null when it is absolutely true. That's the right thing to do. If it's true, you don't want to reject it. The second possibility is that you reject it when it's true. That's a type 1 error because if it's true, you don't want to reject it, okay? So type 1 error is you reject it when it's true. If you will, you could say, oh, well, let's just talk about number 3 and we'll come back to what we'll say later. For number 3, and this is the second type of error, you choose not to reject it when it's false, okay? So if it's false, you should reject it. If you choose not to, you're making a mistake. So that's the second type of error. And then if you choose to reject it when it's false, well, that's a good thing to do. So that's not a problem. So let's put it to you this way. In the modern parlance, somebody calls you looking for an extended warranty on your car. Or better yet, forget the extended warranty on the car. You get an email that says some Nigerian prince wants to leave you $5 million. Okay? Now, clearly that's a false statement. So if you reject that email, and it's a false statement, you have done the 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 on the screen. You've done the 4 thing. Yes, that's the right thing to do. But if you choose not to reject it when it is false and you give them all the data, that is a type 2 error and you are going to get a whole lot of problems based on that. Okay? Now, there's another type of error you can make. So the first type of error, and the one that in this case is the one that most people would likely make if they were making an error, is that they'd say, oh my God, he must be telling me the truth. Let me give him all my financial information. And it's actually, he's telling you the thing is false. That's a type 2 error. But there is another type of error that could be made. He could actually be telling you the truth. And you choose to say, forget it, no way. And you say no, and then you never get the money that you could have had. That's a type 1 error. Now, granted, that's not going to happen with some Nigerian prince with millions of dollars he wants to leave you, but it is possible to make that mistake. So we want to recognize that mistake. All right. So let's go on and see some samples and see how they do. Here's an example 9.5. Suppose the null hypothesis is this. Frank's rock climbing equipment is safe. So the hypothesis is that the equipment is safe. A type 1 error would be to say that Frank thinks his equipment might not be safe, and it really is safe. Okay? So let's go back for 1 second. Type 1 errors always occur when it is true. Okay? A type 1 error always occurs when it's true, and you choose to reject it anyway. A type 2 error occurs when it's false, and you choose not to reject it, okay? So, looking up here, the type 1 error occurs when Frank thinks his rock climbing equipment might not be safe, but it is really safe. And that's the statement. The statement is, the null statement is that it is safe. And assuming that's true, or finding out that it's true, then he would be making an error saying it's not safe when it really is, okay? So remember, all type 1 errors are made when the null hypothesis is true. Type 2 error. Frank thinks his rock climbing equipment may be safe when in fact it's not safe. That's really dangerous because Frank can die. Here's the thing. Type 2 errors are made when the null hypothesis is false. Okay? And we're going to talk about this A and B stuff in a little while, but A is the probability that Frank thinks his rock climbing equipment may not be safe when in fact it really is. And B is the probability that Frank thinks his rock climbing equipment may be safe when in fact it's not safe. We'll talk about that more later, but not much right now. Notice that in this case, the error with the greater consequence is definitely type 2. Frank can die, all right? So let's take a look at this. Try it, 9.5. Suppose the null hypothesis, H sub 0, is that the blood cultures contain no traces of a pathogen, okay? So the null hypothesis is that the blood does not contain the pathogen. Pathogen is disease. State the type 1 and the type 2 errors. Go ahead, do a stop and start on that. So here's your null hypothesis that the blood cultures contain no traces of the pathogen. Type 1, remember type 1, it's always true. So if you think there are traces of the pathogen when there are no traces, remember, it's true. So there's no traces is true. And then you think there are actually traces. That's a mistake. Okay, that's type 1 error. And then the type 2 error occurs when the null is false. So if there are traces of the pathogen, but you think, no way, there are no traces, right? That's the kind of mistake a little kid, little kids will make that mistake. That's a type 2 error. So type 1 errors occur when the null is true. Type 2 when the null is false. Okay. So analyzing it again, as soon as I realize that the null statement is true and I reject it, it's a type 1 error. As soon as I realize that the null statement is false and I choose not to reject it, well, that's another kind of mistake, and that's a type 2 error or mistake. This is a pretty funny slide that kind of shows it up. The null hypothesis is that you are not pregnant. So the doc looks at him, and it's a false positive. He looks at a man, and he says, you're pregnant. He's choosing to reject the null hypothesis when it is true. He is obviously not pregnant, but he's saying you are pregnant. That's not possible. That's a false positive. That's a type 1 error. And then you got a lady sitting there with a baby, pretty obviously pregnant. And by the way, gentlemen in class, you never, am I clear on this? You never comment on whether a woman is pregnant or not until she tells you. You can only cause damage. Never, ever, ever say it. So just mentioning, don't go anywhere near that, okay? So in the second one, you have a woman who looks obviously pregnant, and the doctor looks at her and says, no, you're not pregnant, okay? So that's a false negative. So a type 1 error is a false positive error, right? Positive because it's true, but then he chooses not to reject it, okay? All right, so let's go to another way to look at type 1 versus type 2 error. Type 1 error is a false positive. The test result says you have coronavirus, but you actually do not have coronavirus. So you don't have it is a true statement. That's the null statement in all of this because it is true. But the test result says you have it. So the test result is wrong because you really truly don't have it. That's a type 1 error. And type 2 error is that the test result says you don't have coronavirus and you actually do. Remember, they're always about the falseness of it. So you're choosing to reject the null hypothesis when it is true. And that's a type error, okay? The fact that you don't have it, that's the true statement. Look up here. You decide to get tested based on mild symptoms. There are 2 errors that could occur, okay? And then for the next one, you choose not to reject the null hypothesis when it is false, okay? So the original hypothesis, the null hypothesis, is that you don't have it. And assuming you don't have it, they turn around and they reject that you don't have it. They say, oh, no, you really do have it. And we've all heard of people who've had false positives with coronavirus. That's a type 1 error. And a type 2 error is a false negative. You don't hear so much about that with the coronavirus. But the bottom line is sometimes the test result might say that you don't have it, but you actually do. And if the null hypothesis is that you don't have it, then when you actually do have it, the null is false, okay? So remember, the null statement is true leads to a type 1 error. The null statement is false leads to a type 2 error. Some practice questions. What do you represent the null hypothesis with? H sub O. Which of the following best describes a type 1 error? The null is true, but we reject it mistakenly. The null is false, we fail to reject it. The null is false, we reject it. The null is true, we fail to reject it. Here it is. The null is true, but we mistakenly reject it. Remember, all type 1 errors are based on the null statement being true. Next one up. The null hypothesis always contains an equal sign. Okay? Which of the following best describes a type 2 error? The null is true and we mistakenly reject it. I think it's supposed to say underneath that the null is false and we fail to reject it. Next one, the null is false and we mistakenly reject it. The null is true, but we reject it, I guess, is what it says after that. I don't know why the rest of that got cut off. Okay. The null is false, but we fail to reject it. Remember, type 2 always has to do with the null being false. And if it's false, we should reject it, right? But if we fail to reject it, then we have made a mistake, and that's a type 2 mistake. All right, so that's an explanation of type 1 and type 2 mistakes. The big thing you got to remember from that, type 1 mistakes occur when that null hypothesis is true, and then we don't reject it, because we should. If it's true, if it's true, we should not reject it. And if we accidentally or mistakenly reject it when it's true, then that would be a big mistake. Think of the Nigerian prince. But it's also a type of mistake to reject it if it's false. And then if it's false, we should reject it. That's what you should remember. But then we don't. So a type 2 one is when it's false and we don't reject it, and we should. Okay? So type 1 occurs when the null is true. Type 2 occurs when the null is false. All right.